Hi there, this is John Muir Laws, and today I want to give you a few tricks and tips about how to draw a forest. So by drawing a forest, I mean not just an individual tree out there, but you're looking at a distant landscape and there's a giant mass of trees, lots of trees all together, and you want to draw the forest, not just tree, 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 tree. If you draw tree, 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 it'll look like a funky Christmas tree farm and you're not going to be happy with your drawing. So we're going to look at how to draw that mass of the forest, but we're also going to get deep inside the forest and look out. And I'm going to show you a couple of thoughts about how to approach that. To get started though, let's take a look at some forest drawings that I've got in my sketchbooks. And what you're going to see is that these drawings can either be they can be representational of the forest itself, but they also can be sort of more simplified and diagrammatic. This is this crazy cool tree that I found in Mexico, kind of the Roman numeral #3 tree, and I ended up kind of making a diagram of how I think it formed this way. It was a strangler fig, but very, very cool thing. Now, if I was just drawing the whole forest, I might lose some of the specific information about this. So here I'm not interested in representing the forest, but just to make to share information about what I was looking at. This drawing as well, this is a cross section of a little riparian woodland, showing the how it was being used by different sorts of critters. And my goal here again is not to draw a portrait of that landscape, but to share information about it. So think about the reason behind why you're drawing your woodland. Sometimes if you're trying to describe something that you see, a portrait of that may not be the best thing for you. If you are in the forest, here's a couple of woodland landscapitos. This was in snow. And what I find is if you're sitting in the forest looking out at the whole forest, it really quickly gets overwhelming because you don't know where to stop. But if you pick a small chunk of that forest that you're in, so you're not going all the way up to the top of the trees, you can get in and out of your drawing much more quickly. So a framed vignette of part of a forest that you're sitting in, you're going to find is a much easier way to go about things than just starting drawing a tree and stopping that drawing when you get to the edge of your paper and just going wall to wall. You'll very quickly kind of get overwhelmed and overrun by the immensity and vastness of everything. But you can make your life a lot easier just by simplifying it with a little tiny frame about what you see. Generally, my strategy is the more overwhelming a subject is, the more I tend to just draw it smaller. That gives me a little way of controlling what I see. Here is a sketch of a forest, streamside forest above a waterfall. And you'll notice that the top edge of it is suggestive of a forest, but once you kind of get down lower, that is very loosely handled. What I find is that if you have a sketch of a forest, the top edge of it feels like a forest. And there are some deep shadows in there to kind of give you a sense of depth, to kind of carefully place some of your deeper shadows. You can get a sense of the forest without drawing tree, 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 tree. When you're looking at a distant forest, you're not often seeing the edges of each individual tree. You're seeing it as a mass of forest with a few kind of tree-ish moments poking out. Here are a few more kind of quick sketches of forests and looking out through the forest at a distant setting sun. This is during when we had these crazy wildfires here in California. And the sun was setting as this weird red sphere down into the smoke. But notice that these trees, again, the tops of some of them have very distinct tree-looking shapes. But if you do that, you can get away with some fairly rough handling of a lot of the rest of the foliage. So more on this a little bit later. So now let's draw the forest. All right, here is your enemy. This is what you don't want to do. If you make your forest edge with this zigzag up, down, up, down, up, down sawtooth pattern, it's easier for your pencil to make this, but it's going to feel very mechanical, and it's going to feel like kind of a cartoon version of a forest. It's not going to feel to you like a forest. What you want for a forest edge is kind of a bad EKG reading or a chaotic stock report. You want your line of your forest to be consistently inconsistent. And so some are higher, some are lower, but there's not a dun 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 pattern to it. Very often, if you look out at the forest edge that's in front of you, you'll see some of this. You'll see this kind of sense of randomness in it, and that's going to be something that's going to be helpful to get. So I'm going to take this line. I'm going to copy it a couple of times, and I am going to superimpose over it either squiggles up or squiggles down, and take a look at the shapes of the pine trees that are around you, and you'll see that some species kind of swoop up, some swoop down, so you kind of get the general swoop of your forest. And then what you're going to do is shade into this forest a middle value, so that here you're filling these shapes with a middle value. And then we're going to do what I call these cones, these downward facing cones of darkness. So notice that I've put in some of the trees in the background, I've started to shade them dark, and where the edge of the tree meets the boundary with the next tree, I start kind of cutting in, and at that point making a cone that points down. So there's the part that points up, that's the tree. The part that points down, if you do it this way, it's going to generally suggest that there's a lot of depth in this forest, and you're seeing the edges of the trees in the foreground by making this darker area in the back. Notice that in the two videos, or in the two shapes there, that these are, I've picked different trees to be my dark trees. So you can randomly do this in a drawing, and you'll get a sense of the forest, and there'll be a depth in this forest. So I'm not drawing individual trees, but I'm getting the suggestion of individual trees. Finally, if you kind of ground your trees with a little bit of shadows at the bases of them, this will give your trees a place to stand, and it'll feel like you have a forest. So what that was is a random EKG line, either going up or down. I'm picking some of those trees and shading them down, giving a sense of depth in the forest and defining the edges of lighter foreground trees that are kind of more out on the edge of the forest and in the light. And then a little bit of shadow down on the bottoms of those, and you've got yourself a forest. Here I've added a couple of dead trees in the background, and hey, check it out. It's a quick forest. So this approach, what you end up doing is you get a sense of the forest, not just a bunch of individual trees. We'll be using this technique a little bit later on to make, or right now as a matter of fact, to make a landscape sketch. So you can either frame what you want to do right at the start, or sometimes what I'll do is I'll start kind of lightly blocking in a landscape sketch and then put a frame around part of that. But what you want to avoid doing is just going wall to wall on your piece of paper and drawing everything that is in front of you. Don't let your size of your paper be what controls your composition. So you decide what part of the landscape you're going to do. I'll often block that in with a non-photo blue pencil, and then I'm going to put some jaggedy edges in on my landscape here. By the way, just in this landscape form, what I'm trying to do is get a sense of depth by overlapping forms. I want some shapes in the foreground overlapping other elements that are further and further behind them. This intentional overlap is a very powerful way to suggest depth. Now I'm going to use a line to give me a little bit more detail on the tops, the edges of these forest masses. So there's in the foreground in front of you, there's a few aspen trees with rounded tops, and then coniferous forests in the middle ground. You notice in the background, those hills have more coniferous forests on them. Notice how the forest edge is handled in a different way in the foreground, middle ground, and background. In the background, it's a little line with just kind of a few little tick marks right across it. In the foreground, you've got these lines suggesting trees. Now, value. In the foreground, I want darker values. In the background, I'm going progressively lighter values. That's going to give you a sense of atmospheric perspective, kind of going back in depth. So I'm starting just with some large areas of value, getting lighter as the drawing goes further into the background. And now I'm starting those, remember those downward pointing cones on the tips of some of these trees? That's what I have just put on the tops of these trees. And then I'm going to, just in a few other random areas, I am going to drop other cones down, increasing the sense of depth in the forest. So I've got those ones right along the top. Again, here I've lightened the whole thing so you can see what I'm doing a little bit more easily. So these are, so you kind of get a sense of the tops of some of the trees that are a little bit closer to you, because I've got those dark points hanging down from the top of my forest. And then I'm going to essentially make little kind of twister shapes, little tornadoes of dark that are going to start across a broader area and come to sharper points. So you can see several places in there, kind of as you go towards the bottom of some of these little twisters, you're getting darker, 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 darker towards the bottom. That here, in this, when I've got everything pale like this, it stands out much more as like a bunch of little dark squiggles. Feels less like a forest, but the whole thing has a tone over it that really begins to feel like, oh, these are shadows and depth in the forest. I'm going to do the same thing in the background. Let me lighten the whole thing so you can see what these background lines really look like. Notice I'm not drawing individual trees here. I'm putting in some of these tornado squiggles down, and it's feeling like, oh, there's forest back there. In the front foreground trees, I can get a kneaded eraser and pick out just a few little edges of light on the sides of some of those trees. It gives you a little bit more depth in that foreground. Here is a little bit of color in my aspens, or value in the aspens, and across that field in the background, some horizontal lines to help people see, like, oh, this is a flat plane, and here it is tilting up on the side. So here it is without that, with that, without that, with that. And lastly, a little bit of value in the sky, and hey, check that out. Right, so that is one way of drawing a coniferous forest. The next thing that I want to do is show you an approach to drawing the forest from the inside, kind of looking out through the trees, and how to get a sense of depth in that. Here is the drawing. And at first it looks, oh my gosh, this is really complex. How would you even start? Well, I'm going to show you how you're going to start with this. And yeah, you can do this. And the trick to getting this sense of depth in this forest is to intentionally work in layers in your drawing. And you're going to start, we're going to work in layers, and you're going to go from light to dark. So as you go from the background to the foreground, you're going to first put in the background very lightly, then you're going to get closer and closer and closer into the foreground. So this started off with just a little frame. And if you're working on toned paper, one of the first things you can do is get some gouache and put in a few kind of light areas, really light values, some whites into the background, that these will kind of come glowing through your paper. And then here is my background. And notice that this background is it's not very detailed. It's really kind of scratchy. I've got major trunks. I've got some branches sticking out on my trees. And this is what I'm going to do for foliage on those branches. At the top and the bottom, a lot of this is going to be covered up by other parts of my drawing, so I don't even have to make these, complete trees. But these sort of light shapes in the background are going to give you a sense of that there's trees way back there. Some of the lower branches have already lost their needles on their branches because they can't get enough sunlight. So very often lower branches in a forest, there's no there are not leaves on those, and that's what I'm kind of representing here. One last point about this is that if you're doing this, say, with a pencil, what you want is a fairly soft and very dull pencil. Let me emphasize that. You're using a dull pencil, because what the dull pencil does is allows you to make sort of a stripe of a trunk, and if you want it a little bit thicker, you can go back a couple of times, and it gives you an area of tone instead of two sharp little lines that you would get with a sharp pencil. So a sharp pencil gives you little lines. With a dull pencil, you can put this down and kind of get an area of tone. Now what you're going to do is go for the next layer closer to you, and you're going to go darker. So pressing harder, or using, if you've got multiple colored, not colored pencils, but if you have multiple graphite pencils of different hardness, now you're using a softer pencil. You could also do this approach with watercolor. If you're using watercolor, you let the background dry completely before adding in the next layer. Right, so I'm putting this darker on top of the other one. I'm being consistently inconsistent with my tree trunks. So my tree trunks here, some are thicker, some are thinner, some are closer together, some are more widely spaced apart. I want to be consistently inconsistent. So first my trunks, and then with the same value, here are horizontal branches sticking out. And into the top parts of some of these trees, I'm going to give them clumps of foliage. Notice that I'm not drawing individual pine needles in these coniferous branches. At this distance, you're not going to be seeing individual pine needles. You're going to be seeing clumps of needles. And lastly, we're going to kind of go into the foreground here. So again, being consistently inconsistent, going even darker now. Here are my big dark trunks, big dark vertical columns, and then I can add in some branches coming out from my trees, some foliage at the top, and hey, check it out. You've got this sense of a forest going deeper and deeper, kind of into the background. Perhaps it's a misty day, a little bit of haze in the air, a bit of fog in the forest. You get a sense of depth, and that was done by kind of going light to dark and background to foreground. If you're lucky enough that you look out there and you go like, yeah, the background is darker. I mean, sorry, is lighter. You can use this technique. But sometimes you're going to look out at your forest and you're going to say to yourself, you know, rut-row, in this view of this forest, that's not actually what I'm seeing. Sometimes you look at your forest and the distant stuff is darker. Right? If it's really far away, you'll get that big atmospheric effect, atmospheric perspective effect from scattered light, and the background stuff will definitely be lighter. But if you're not looking that far away from you, sometimes the trees that are closer to you, yeah, they look lighter, and they are. So we're going to take a look at how to do that. If you have opaque paint, it's really easy to do. You can start dark and then put lighter trees on top of them. But most of my friends are using watercolor instead of gouache, or if you've got a pencil, you know, pencil doesn't really allow you to go lighter without erasing. But this is going to be sort of the thing that I'm going for. Here I've got my stuff in the background is really dark. My foreground elements are lighter. In this drawing, I'm going to be taking kind of an odd and different approach to how you might handle this. Warning here, this is much harder to do. And it's kind of, I think, a lower percentage technique, especially in something that's really complicated and complex like this. You're going to end up having to kind of draw around all these other shapes. But let's start with just a simpler version of this, and I'll show you the technique that we're going to be doing. This little song sparrow here wants a background. How are we going to give it to the bird? There's a bunch of brambles, blackberry brambles behind it. So I'm going to start just by giving it a little circle of green, and then with my pencil I'm going to draw in the edges of my leaves. Where do I have my vines coming through? Where do I have my leaves? So I draw on the edges of my leaves and then I paint them in, but I don't paint the leaves. Instead, I paint the spaces between the leaves. So you paint the spaces between the leaves, and all of a sudden those leaves are popping out as lighter objects against a darker background, and you did it with watercolor. So you didn't need opaque paint to get this kind of effect. You can have things with a dark background, and it is the things that are in the foreground are lighter. But it's, notice it's a little bit, it's harder to do. You're having to paint around all of your positive shapes, so you're filling in all those negative shapes. That's going to be the way that you're going to handle this drawing over here. So it's going to start, again, we're going to be drawing from light to dark, but this time from foreground going into background. If there's some pale sky in the very background, you can drop that in if you're using toned paper with some gouache. Let that dry, and then you're going to put your foreground elements in front of that. Here in the foreground, I'm going to give my foreground elements a little bit more contrast because I want them to feel closer to me. They're going to have lighter trunks and slightly darker needles. And now the hard part is to get the next level of forest, I'm going to have to draw around all of these shapes. So if I want my next level in, you would be working kind of drawing around. Let's take a look at that far left-hand tree trunk. It's coming up and there's a little branch that goes across it. You'd have to stop shading in your trunk, skip over that branch, and then continue on again. So in a very complicated picture like this one, it's going to take a long time and it's not going to be that much fun. So that's why I think this is it's a lower percentage technique, but useful to notice that we're still kind of going from light to dark, handling those trees in the same way. Those back ones are just silhouettes going with some branches and a suggestion of foliage. Here is the furthest background zone. Now punching that in with the darkest graphite that you have, and you have a sense of depth in the picture. You might get views like this if you're looking towards a sunset, and you might see a little bit more value in the trees and lighter in the trees that are really close to you, but as you're kind of looking out at those background trees, they can be against that light sky really, really, really dark. Take home, two ways of doing this. The top one, so much easier because you can just draw your dark trees on top of your light ones. So when you're out in the forest, you kind of go like, ooh, I can use that approach to getting depth in my forest. Be happy. Both of these views are looking out sideways through the forest. But sometimes when you're in the woods, you like to look up. So we're going to do one more study, kind of standing in the forest, but this time we're going to look up at the trees above us. Here's my frame and a little bit of lightning element in there. This is what might be done with gouache. If you're looking up at a bunch of treetops, this is where perspective is going to come into play. And if you are, say, lying on your back and there are trees all around you and you're looking up, you're going to see every tree top pointing towards a point directly above your head. If they're vertical tree trunks, they're going to be pointing to a spot directly above your head. If you're not looking straight up, there still will be a point where all those trees, if they were long enough, they would all come together. So essentially, you have a vanishing point for these treetops, but it's not on a horizon. It's directly at your zenith, above your head. It's directly above your head. So I put in my little red X here. That's going to be my target for where my tree trunks are going to be pointing. So working light to dark again, here are my light background trees. Notice that the ones in the middle are pointing straight up. The ones on the sides are kind of tilted in to point at that spot above them. So that's their target. Those are the far background trees, not detailed at all. They're going to be mostly covered up by other stuff. And then there are the foreground trees. So here are my trunks. Notice that they are pointing up towards that red X. Now, if some of them are just off a little bit and they're not pointing exactly towards that, that's fine. That means that tree is not perfectly vertical. It's got a little bit of a lean to it, and you'll see that here and there in the forest, so that's okay. And then I need needles on my trees. Again, I'm not going to be drawing needle, needle, needle. I'm going to be suggesting clumps of needles. And more clumpy up at the top, where you're looking up at big sort of masses of things. As you get lower, you're looking more down through sort of the sides of the tree. But you'll see that the foliage gets very, very dense up there at the tops of those trees. And that gives you a sense of being in the forest and looking up. All of these examples have been with coniferous forests. Here's a couple of sketches from my notebooks looking at deciduous forests. Here are some oak woodlands on hills. Notice how the leaves in the background on that top left oak are handled. It's just masses of foliage with a little bit of a leaf shape to them. In the middle, you can kind of see some jagged edges that look a little bit more leafy. That's all you have to do to kind of give a feeling, suggest that these are leaves. If you get in there and start drawing leaf, 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 it takes a long time, and it won't look really leafy. On the bottom right one, some oak trees on a hillside. Notice that there are sort of it's the same general principles. There's an outside edge that feels a little bit kind of tree-shaped, and that's a regularly irregular edge, so not a bump to bump to bump kind of classic cloud-like tree form, so an irregular tree-ish edge. And then what I'm doing is I am drawing the shadows, the masses of the shadows on those trees, and also the shadows as they connect with the ground. That grounds those trees. That's just like I was doing in the coniferous forest drawing, where I had a general shape of the forest and I was drawing in the shadows then from that top edge. Here I'm leaving kind of a halo, a little glow along the top edge of a bunch of these clumps of trees that suggests sunlight falling on those. And if I'm in under the branches of one of these oak trees, that drawing can feel really overwhelming unless I drop a frame around it. So you see in that one top left, there's a frame around the edge which gives me permission to stop drawing the entire tree. Pick the part of the tree that's the most interesting to you, draw that, and then stop. You don't have to draw that entire tree. And if you do start trying to draw that entire tree, you're going to realize very quickly that the tree actually is going to be much bigger than you thought, and you run into the edges of your paper, so you start kind of squishing the edges so it fits on your paper, and it just doesn't look good. Here was a quick study of a bluebird that was hanging out on an oak branch, that little knob sticking up on that oak branch there. That's my little bluebird. And notice again, that frame around the edge allows you to stop drawing. And you still get a sense of, oh wow, you know, okay, there's this oak branch and there's this tangle of foliage that's going to be kind of complex up there. You can handle drawing a little bit of complexity in a few of these branches, and you still have the patience to draw them well. If you're filling your entire page with this, you'd eventually get sick of drawing branches, and you make them kind of more fast and often a little bit more kind of scruffy and not looking really good. And then you go, oh, I don't like my drawing. But if you just take what you're interested in, throw a frame around that, and draw that, you then are able to take the time, do the stuff that you are going to handle in your sketch, do it right, and then move on to the next drawing. That's a few tricks to help you handle drawing a forest from far away or sitting under the branches, kind of looking out from underneath the tree. Give it a try. These aren't the only way to do this. This doesn't mean this is the right way to do this, but this is a few tricks you can put in your bag and play with it. Try a few forest drawings and think of them as studies. They don't have to look right. Think of them as studies and sort of see what techniques work for you. Then the next time you're out there nature journaling and you want to draw a forest, either far or close, you'll have strategies at your fingertips that you've already kind of messed around with. It won't be nearly as intimidating, and you're going to have a lot of fun. Happy sketching, and I'll see you in the field.